welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast, where every day we dive deep into the world of technology and exploring the latest trends, innovations, and conversations that matter. And today, I want to talk about the race to develop central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, which you've probably been reading a lot about in the media recently. And here in the UK, there's been a lot of news about the government pushing forward with a digital pound project, and the EU and Montenegro also making great strides in the CBDC space. There's so much to unpack, so I've invited Oliver Linch, CEO of Bittrex Global, to join me on the podcast today and talk about it in a language that everyone can understand. And he's also a London-based lawyer with a wealth of experience in financial regulation and fintech. So I'm hoping Oliver will help us separate fact from fiction as we discuss the current state of CBDCs in Europe and the issues that they're facing. So in this episode, we'll explore why the UK is embracing CBDCs with its digital pound project despite a fragile economy and ongoing political uncertainty. And we'll also explore the causes of opposition to CBDCs and the slow progress of EU's digital euro project since its inception 2 years ago, back in 2021. So buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you are in the world, I'm going to beam your ears to the UK, where you can join myself and Oliver Linch in conversation about all things central bank digital currencies and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Thank you very much for the welcome. A real pleasure to be here. So my name is Oliver Linch, and I'm CEO of Bittrex Global, which is one of the world's leading secure regulated crypto exchanges. I am a lawyer by background. I spent over a decade as a financial services regulatory lawyer at a US firm practicing in the UK, US, and the Middle East, specializing in traditional regulatory finance, exchanges, financial market infrastructure. And then as things got on and developed, I became more and more interested in fintech and crypto in general. I joined Bittrex Global originally as General Counsel in 2021, which is a role that I still hold in conjunction with my role as CEO, which I took up last year.
Awesome. Well, a big welcome to the podcast. There was so many reasons that I was excited to get you on here today, especially as a London-based lawyer and CEO of crypto exchange Bittrex Global, because there's a big topic at the moment which seems to divide the community, and that is central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs for short. So I've got to ask, can you share your insights on the current state of where we're at the moment in Europe, and also how you're seeing the landscape evolving?
Sure. CBDCs, as you say, do divide opinion. And, you know, the interesting thing about this sector is the speed with which things evolve. So what was true yesterday may not be true today. And when you've got this interesting mix of private companies trying to develop things and central banks trying to develop things at the same time, what one thinks of as a CBDC really can be a moving target. But I think my overall perception from within both the crypto community and the legal community is that the case is really yet to be made convincingly as to what they're for. You know, for those people that see the benefit of crypto in general, that tends to be premised on the benefits of DLT, distributed ledger technology, the blockchain. And CBDCs, generally speaking, in the way they're generally structured, are not on the blockchain. They're controlled by a central government or by a central bank. And so I encounter a lot of people at conferences and in my conversations who just say, well, what's the point? You've missed the fundamental attractive nature of cryptocurrencies, which is that they build on the blockchain. Yeah. And my favorite analogy of this is it's like someone who said, guys, I've just invented a new form of firework, right? And what you do is you plant it in the ground and you light it and it shoots up into the air, exactly like a normal firework. But then there's no loud bang and there are no bright colors. And everyone else stands around and goes, but we were mostly in it for the loud bang and the bright colors. You've invented, I don't know what it is, but it ain't a firework.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that sentiment really carries across to CBDCs, and it's like, okay, you've got this thing that's cool. We're like, as a sector, we're all about innovation and creation, but why? What does it achieve? And then you get the people even further opposed who say, well, okay, we know what it achieves, right? What it achieves is a huge amount of centralization of data within the hands of central banks. And with that comes a huge amount of power. And you get people, and you can dismiss them as conspiracy theorists or eco warriors or whatever it is, who say, well, actually, this is a way of government being able to control, monitor and control everything we do. If I go into a shop and buy a pack of chewing gum using a CBDC, the government can know about it. Now, I say, well, the government's not particularly interested in me buying a pack of chewing gum, and that's probably true, but they'd be more interested if I were a protester, if I were engaged in activities designed to thwart the government, if I was striking, right? And then you think, well, actually, if everyone's moved to CBDCs and the government has the ability to simply shut off money to groups of people, you begin to think, hang on, even those of us that are very skeptical about conspiracy theorists, that doesn't sound ideal, right? And then you think, well, okay, where are the jurisdictions that have most rapidly developed CBDCs? And obviously China is leading the way. And you just begin to think, well, if there's no point in doing it from a blockchain perspective, why are we doing this at all? And I think the obligation really is on the proponents of CBDCs, who do have arguments in favor, right? Speed, ease of cross-border transactions, and a general modernization of the way money works, currency works, right? There's the old adage, if cash was invented today, it would be illegal. All of those things are good advantages, and I think it's incumbent upon proponents of CBDCs to really explain why CBDCs work, why they work better, not only than cash, than normal money, which, by the way, is mostly in digital form anyway. I don't remember the last time I actually handed over a banknote to someone. But not just better than that, but also better than genuine cryptocurrencies, than Bitcoin and ETH and all the rest of it, at achieving what it is we want to achieve. So I think that's why things are so rapidly moving in the case of CBDCs. There is the interest from central governments, and it might just be that and central banks, I should say, it might just be that, they want to join the cool kids in the cool gang. Not that I'm cool, but, crypto in general and digital assets across the board are seen as the future, are seen as the way finance is going, and I think rightly so. And so perhaps it's natural that central banks want to just get in on that. And all the nefarious, we're trying to take control or whatever, is a conspiracy theory, and actually it's just a matter of being on the inside. If that's the case, then maybe that's fine, and they should come out and say that. But I think what's lacking really is the answers to the question, why? Why are you bothering? Why are you doing this? And why should I care?
And I think it's so important that we have conversations like we're having today, because I think we've all seen what happened over the last 20, 30 years with Silicon Valley's, hey, let's move fast and break things. And there are future implications to everything that we do and decide now. And no matter what side of the fence you're on, whether you believe in conspiracy theories or you don't, I think let's just park all that. We've seen governments do this before with the Canadian truckers, right? Because anyone that supported that, all those accounts were completely locked down. So there is an element of wanting to shut protests down with financial incentive. There's been a precedent already, hasn't there?
Well, I mean, that is the example that's given. And I think a lot of people, whether you agree with the truckers or you agree with the government, whatever it is, it's the principle that matters. And you think, well, okay, money, for better or for worse, is the foundation of all of our activity. It's how we survive as a society. It's already very centralized. The ethos of cryptocurrencies is a decentralization of that, is a removal of the central powers. And this isn't just a return to centralization, but a doubling down, right? If anything, it would make it easier. Well, it would make it easier for things like happened in Canada to happen if everyone were transacting using CBDCs. And not only could you stop down identified accounts from protesters, but you would know everyone that they're interacting with. The central bank would know everyone that they're interacting with, where and when they made their purchases, who was on the other side of that purchases, who those people have gone on to speak to. And you begin to think, actually, there's an awful lot of information that's being centralized here. And privacy concerns stop being the sort of thing that geeky lawyers like me, who spend their time worrying about the GDPR, talk about, and start being something that affects, every aspect of everyday life.
100% with you. And if we come back to here in the UK, where we're talking today, we have a fragile economy. There's ongoing political uncertainty, lost count of how many prime ministers we've had, and the whole country seemingly is on strike at some point this year or over the last 12 months. I'm curious, why do you think the UK has chosen to embrace CBDCs with its digital pound project now? Is it because they want to join the cool kids or something else? Any insights you can offer around that?
Despite what we've been talking about the potential for misuse, I generally don't think that governments or central banks are in it for nefarious purposes. Mm-hmm. I generally tend to think that although it's right to be vigilant and it's right to have regard to the possibility of misuse of these things, generally speaking, the government isn't after us. The government isn't trying to destroy us. That's not in their interest. It's not in our interest. It's not how society works. So I think it's important to bear that in mind, and that's not to write off those concerns, but to put them in context. As to why, the enthusiasm for the digital pound or Bitcoin, which is a great pun, by the way. I don't know why they're recording from the Bitcoin pun. I think that's great. I think it's a combination of things. I think there are genuine possible advantages to CBDCs. I think, the speed and ease of transactions, especially when you're talking cross-border, is something that's lacking in traditional finance. And it's one of the main motivating reasons behind cryptocurrencies. It is still the case. If I want to send some money to a friend in France, it's enormously painful. It takes time and it's expensive. And it's in the current financial climate in 2023, it's bizarre to me and to many other people just how difficult that is. Now, CBDCs do provide a way to make that easier, and as the world becomes more and more global and transactions really don't need to respect national borders in the same way, that is a huge advantage. I think they, both in terms of speed and in terms of cost. I think there are other attractive features too. I mean, the fact is the world has moved on from the days of cash. In the EU, the e-money directive and the regime under that never really worked. It was never really fit for purpose. It was developed right on the cusp of when this technology was evolving, and so it's kind of outdated. And CBDCs are kind of the next iteration of that. And in many ways, I think that's the motivating factor. It's why are we doing this? Well, it's what's next, right? We invented, as a society, we invented money, and we invented banking. Then we invented digitization of banking. And now we're inventing central bank digital currencies. And I think there's just a sense of this is the right thing for any country to do as part of the journey towards a fully digital financial future. And I think that's a motivating factor behind it, coupled with all the extraneous, being part of the cool kids narrative. And also in the case of the UK in particular, we have a prime minister who has been very vocally in favor of digital assets across the board. And maybe, there's a sentiment that this is a relatively easy win. It's something that's within the control of a combination of the government and the Bank of England. So it's something that they can actually do to demonstrate in a material way their commitments to digital assets as a whole, and their sector, and the sector as a whole. And so, there's a low-hanging fruit argument to be had here. So maybe that's a motivating factor as well. That's certainly one that I've heard being put forward.
And we have touched on some of the concerns there, especially around centralisation. But I'm curious, are there any other primary causes of oppositions towards CBDCs that you're seeing? And why do you think the EU has also yet to make significant progress, despite, I think it was first introduced in 2021, 2 years ago. Any idea on what's slowing the process down there, and any other concerns?
Well, I think the main concern that people have is confusion, because CBDCs mean so many different things to so many different people say it can often feel like you're playing a game with real moving goalposts. And the same acronym can be used to cover a multitude of different offerings. And I think in a world where clarity is such a prized virtue, and something that financial markets and participants really value, having a bunch of different governments talk about fundamentally different ideas using the same terminology does give rise to confusion. I read one paper that said that the digital pound might actually be issued on a blockchain. And you think, well, that's interesting, but that's a significantly different proposal from a centralized currency. So, why are we still calling that the same thing? And I think that the frustration that people have with CBDCs in general is exactly that. On the EU point as to why they haven't really made any progress, I think layered on top of all of those difficulties that every government is encountering are the structural uniquenesses of the euro and the way the euro works and the interaction between the various institutions at the EU level, and the fact that obviously the EU is not a single country, and has that additional layer of complexity on top of it. All negotiations go through all 27 member states, and everyone has their own views. And then you get into the politics of the kind of two-speed Europe of the southern jurisdictions and the northern jurisdictions, which really do seem to be moving at different speeds, both financially and in terms of interest in digital assets. So I think it's not surprising. The EU has many virtues, but speed of action tends not to be one of them.
Yeah, I think we've all seen elements of that over the years. And so with the majority of CBDC projects across Europe remaining at the pilot phase, what do you think needs to happen to help these projects advance? Above everything else, clarity. Yeah. I think we come back to there needs to be a clear mission statement, a clear understanding of why we're bothering, and a sense of purpose that I think has been lacking. In many cases, these announcements about CBDCs tend to just be a little bit lumbering, a little bit like we got distracted by this thing over here, so now we're going over here for a bit. And there doesn't really seem to be a unifying answer as to how they're going to be structured, and to come back to that same question, why we're bothering, what the goal is, what we're trying to achieve here, what problem it is we're trying to solve, and how it solves it. So how do, let's say, if we look at EU-wide digital euro, Bitcoin, and so many other CBDC efforts across Europe, how are they comparing in terms of things like progress, implementation, and potential impact on the financial landscape? Is it too early to tell at the moment? I mean, too early to tell as between sort of, let's call it Western Europe as a whole, but lagging behind clearly jurisdictions that have forged ahead with their CBDCs. First amongst those is China, which really does seem to have made significant progress. Now, you can speculate as to why that is, and obviously with just being one country, they don't have the negotiations and the difficulties that having 27 vibrant democracies arguing about things necessarily entails. But as between, the Western European progress, I think it's all much of a muchness at the moment because nobody's really going anywhere particularly fast. And I think another big topic at the moment is any tech project, no matter what it is for any business, it's all about ROI. What value are we generating here? So what are the potential costs and risks associated with CBDCs? And do you think I've seen that some economic advisors are arguing that central banks shouldn't even be involved in these projects. Where do you stand on this? Well, the ROI thing is really interesting because, of course, if it's a central bank-driven initiative, those calculations don't happen in exactly the same way as they would if it were a private company. And that may well explain the frustration a lot of people have with these projects not really moving forwards. Because, yes, on the one hand, when it's a government entity, you have lots of consultation requirements and lots of discussion, which generally we think is a good thing. But on the other hand, there are no shareholders in the traditional sense breathing down the neck of a business saying, come on, what progress are you making? What return am I getting on my investment? So I think actually that the fact that it's central banks that are driving this forward or are supposed to be driving it forward,
does explain to some extent why significant progress hasn't been made. Yeah, if you were a company developing a product and it was taking this amount of time to make this little progress, you would come into some really quite unpleasant questions at your next shareholder meeting.
Yeah. I know you don't have the answers to this, but I'm going to ask you to have a look into a virtual crystal ball and tell me how you envision CBDCs influencing things like the global financial ecosystem, particularly in terms of things like cross-border transaction, financial inclusion, monetary policy, and ultimately for everybody listening, what does this mean for crypto too?
Well, let me answer. I don't have the answer to that. I don't have a crystal ball. If I did, then that would be a very, very rich man. But I think, if I were a Bitcoin maxi, if I were someone that really went in on Bitcoin and the future of crypto, I would say that all of this is nice nonsense, but it's going to die a death in the next, year, as people begin to really realize that there's either no point to it or the only point is a bad one. And I can appreciate that position. I'm not a Bitcoin maxi. Not least of all because I think a lot of altcoins out there have interesting things to say. If I had to say what I think the best feature of a CBDC is actually moving away from the pure centralization and seeing if there is a way that central banks can find to structure a CBDC so that it does make use of blockchain technology. Because to me, the exciting thing about crypto, the exciting thing about the sector in general, is the use of blockchain technology. And until CBDCs can find a way to at least leverage the advantages of DLT, they're always going to struggle with getting purchase from an interest in people actually using it. So do I think CBDC will just become yet another token that we can trade? No, it will be its own special category. It will have its own features. It will necessarily involve a certain amount of centralization, much more so than we see in utility tokens. But I do think that there must be a way that it can leverage the advantages of blockchain technology to actually make itself a more attractive product.
And it does feel this space is evolving before our very eyes. You said at the very beginning of our conversation, what was true last week might not be true next week. There's so many big changes, so it is a difficult topic to explore. We are in very early days. But what are some of the key regulatory and technological challenges that governments and central banks must address, do you think, if they're going to successfully implement CBDCs? And how can they navigate these obstacles to ensure a secure and efficient digital currency system that everybody wants?
Well, I think the regulatory question is wider than just CBDCs. Governments and policymakers and regulators are really just beginning to get to grips now, probably far too late, with how you do crypto more generally. And so I think, that's the prior question. And once you have an answer on that, you can begin to think about how you layer CBDCs and other types of token on top of that. Now, in the EU, we have MiCA, which should be voted on any day now. We've been promised for a very long time, which does lay out the framework for that. In the UK, obviously in February, published a consultation paper explaining how it might do it. I think the foundation blocks are now being set out for all of that, and what that might look like. And so, again, like where CBDCs fall within that is still this big open question, and just goes to the fundamental question of, well, what are they and what are they going to be and what are they for? And then you can begin to question, well, how should they be regulated? Because if they're there to replace money in an everyday sense, you're going to take the £5 note out of your pocket and replace it with a £5 CBDC, then that suggests one course of regulation. And if it's going to be more of a store of value, then that suggests another source of regulation. If it's going to be a hybrid, then you're going to have a more complex situation. So it has to start with understanding what it is they're trying to achieve, and then you can build a system around that. And I think actually it's a really good question, because what we're seeing is it's the tail wagging the dog. They're like, let's create a system, and then we'll talk about what we're going to use the system for. And it's just doomed to fail, because that's not how regulation can work. You can regulate a thing that exists rather than use regulation to tell people what should exist. So I think there's a little bit of backwards thinking going on there.
Yeah.
But perhaps that's inevitable, given this confusion as to what it is that we're trying to achieve with a CBDC.
Yeah, completely agree with you. So much food for thought there. It's a conversation we could talk about for hours, but I'd love to get you on maybe later in the year or even next year and see how this space is evolving. But before I let you go, I'm going to have a bit of fun with you now. Some of the biggest names in business, VC funding and tech have either been guests or listened to this podcast. So I'm going to see if there's anything I can manifest and do for you here. So is there a person that you'd love to have a private breakfast or lunch with, and why? Because he or she might just be listening to this. I'd love to try and make it happen, but who would you choose?
There are so many possible options here, but I think from a very early age, the name that stuck out to me as the tech guy that has brought about the most change in the world is Bill Gates. And I think he's led such a fascinating and interesting life, like post kind of tech and with his foundation, that kind of stuff, that I think, having the opportunity to sit down with someone like him for half an hour would just tick all of the legal, the tech, and the general interest boxes that I'd be looking for. So maybe it's a twee answer, but I'd really love that. So if you're listening, Bill, then you know where to find me.
Well, I'm going to send that out into the ether now. Let's see what we can manifest. All I ask is you come back and let me know if you do have that lunch.
I would. I think you're guaranteeing it, right? You've promised me now breakfast with Bill Gates, right?
Yes, yeah. I put it out there in the universe, so it's there, it's happening. But anybody interested in exploring this topic a little bit deeper, maybe finding out more information about you, your team, Bittrex Global, what's the best starting point for everything?
Oh, you can find me on LinkedIn, which is at Oliver Linch, or on Twitter, which is also at Oliver Linch, or you can go to global.bittrex.com.
Awesome. And as I said at the very beginning, it's very early stages for this subject. But what my big takeaway for me is it reminded me so much of IT in any business. Everyone wants that big, shiny IT project because, hey, that's what everyone else is doing. At the moment, I suspect it's generative AI. That's all every business is talking about. But it should all come back to, hey, let's park the tech to one side at the moment. Why are we doing this? What do we want to achieve? And then put the tech in place. But just a big thank you for bringing this topic to life today.
A real pleasure to be here, and please do invite me back to see how we get on in 6 months or a year from now.
And that wraps up another episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast. A huge thank you to our special guest, Oliver Linch, CEO of Bittrex Global, for sharing his valuable insights and expertise on the current state of central bank digital currencies across Europe. It's been an enlightening discussion for me, especially around the challenges and opportunities surrounding the digital pound and the EU's digital euro and so many other CBDC projects in the region that I'm hearing about more and more. And of course, as digital currencies continue to evolve, I'll be sure to keep you informed on the latest developments in this rapidly changing space. So don't forget, subscribe to Tech Talks Daily on your favourite podcast platform, and I'll try and keep us all up to date on the latest innovations in the space. And if you'd like to join the conversation or share your thoughts on today's topic, connect with me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram at Neil C. Hughes. Email me techblogwriter@outlook.com. I'd love to hear from you. And a big thank you to Oliver, of course, for joining me today. And for everyone listening, an even bigger thank you for choosing this podcast and tuning in. I know you have a lot of choice out there. So thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.